The Wars of the Roses begin. The fighting in England, which began when the English retreated from France, was to last for 30 years, up to 1485. It was a feud between two branches of the Plantagenet family, the House of Lancaster and the House of York, who were fighting for the crown. Since the white rose was the badge of York and the red rose was the badge of Lancaster, it came to be known as the Wars of the Roses. It was a wild, crazy, treasonous business, and in the end neither side won. After the final battle, there was not a soul left on either side of the royal family to wear the crown. The House of Lancaster and the House of York were both descended from sons of Edward III of England. Henry VI, the king who saw the wars begin, belonged to the House of Lancaster, as did his prime minister, the Duke of Somerset. To start it off, the Duke of York, a square-faced man of action, accused the Duke of Somerset of losing the war in France, either through treason or just plain stupidity. He also claimed by all that was good and holy, he should be king instead of Henry VI, whose grandfather had seized the crown and then forced Parliament to accept him. The Duke of Somerset was furious with the Duke of York. The poor king was completely bewildered. Henry VI, poor kind soul, as good and gentle a man as ever lived, had been king for 30 years, since he was 9 months old. He failed to understand why now, after all these years, his right to be king should be questioned. Why? My father was king. His father before him was king. I have worn the crown from my cradle. How then can my claim be disputed? This he could not understand. Soon after his one and only son was born, he completely lost his mind. He was talking with the bishop about Eton College, which he had founded, when all of a sudden he could not speak. Doctors were called at once. They applied every known remedy, but with no result. The poor king remained insane for 2 years. During that time, the Duke of Somerset sat in prison, while his rival, the Duke of York, acted as regent for the king and ruled the realm. 2 years later, Henry suddenly recovered his senses, and the tables were turned. Somerset was released from prison, and Henry VI was back on his throne. The Duke of York, stripped of his power, rode home to his castle in Yorkshire, to his wife, the Duchess Cecily, and their family of children. They were 8 in number, from Edward, who was 13, down to 3-year-old Richard. The older children were away, being brought up at other castles according to English custom, but the Duke enjoyed the younger ones in his hearty fashion, holding his youngest and prettiest daughter, 9-year-old Margaret, on his broad knee. Then, with a farewell hug and kiss around the family circle, the Duke was off again to war. At the head of his private army of Yorkshiremen, he was soon galloping south towards the city of London. At the same time, galloping north out of London, came the army of Lancaster, headed by the Duke of Somerset. The two armies met head-on with a crash of arms in the first battle of the war, near the town of St. Albans. The Duke of Somerset was killed. The Duke of York then appeared before Parliament and bluntly demanded the crown. Dressed in a crimson doublet, he stepped up and laid a hand firmly on the throne reserved for the king. That was too much for the Earl of Warwick. Warwick, the richest and most powerful earl in England, was a nephew of the Duchess Cecily, and up to this time had been his uncle's most loyal supporter. Now he was shocked by the Duke's demand. "Neither the lords nor the people will allow you to strip the king of his crown," Warwick said later, glaring down at the older man, who glared back so fiercely that it was obvious something had to be done to pacify him. The Earl of Warwick went to the king to arrange a compromise. Henry VI meekly agreed that if he were allowed to finish out his reign undisturbed, after his death the crown should go either to the Duke of York or to his son Edward. Queen Marguerite, mother of the royal prince, was in a towering rage to think that Henry had allowed his own son and heir to be set aside. Being as fiery and high-spirited as the king was meek and mild, she rallied the forces of Lancaster, who met the forces of York near Wakefield, and defeated them in a bloody battle. The Duke of York was killed. The Queen had his head cut off, crowned with a paper crown, and stuck up on a pike over the main gate of his own city of York. Edward, 18 years old, a golden-haired young giant, 6'4", now became the Duke of York. He carried on the war to avenge the death of his father and secure the throne for himself, and was highly successful. He won a decisive battle, and with the help of his cousin, the Earl of Warwick, who was to be known as the King-maker, he became Edward IV. 9-year-old Richard of York was in the Netherlands when he heard the exciting news that big brother Edward had been declared king by their cousin, the Earl of Warwick. After their father's death, the Duchess Cecily had sent her young sons, Richard and his brother George, out of the country to be under the care of the Duke of Burgundy, where they would be safe. Now she wrote that Henry VI and Queen Marguerite had fled to Scotland, and their brother was king. The happy boys, loaded with gifts, sailed for home to be there for the coronation, which took place on June 27, 1461. That was a wonderful day for Richard, who rode in the procession from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey. A frail, undersized, serious little boy, Richard worshipped his big, handsome brother, who was everything he longed to be. In all of his 9 years, the most thrilling day came when the new King Edward IV girded him with a sword and kissed him, saying, "Be thou a good knight." And he became a Knight of the Bath, a Knight of the Garter, and also the Duke of Gloucester. Richard had chosen for his motto, "Loyalty binds me," and he wanted more than anything else in the world to become a good knight and gain the approval of his wonderful brother. 6 months later, his training in knighthood began. On a November day, Richard, astride a rather large horse, was approaching the huge gray stone walls and towers of Middleham Castle, which belonged to the Earl of Warwick. He was about to enter his cousin's household to be trained in knightly courtesy and also to learn how to fight, since war was the actual business of a knight. Other boys were also at the castle for training, as well as the Countess of Warwick and her daughters. The Earl had no son, just 2 little girls, one Richard's age and one who was 5, a shy, pale little wisp of a thing with sad brown eyes, whose name was Anne. At home, Richard had played with his sister Margaret, or Meg, who called him Dickon. Meg was now 15, old enough to be married, and he, Richard, had no more time to play with girls. He was too busy learning to be a knight. Even for boys who were strong and athletic, it was strenuous work to handle a sword, dagger, and massive battle axe. For Richard, encased in a suit of armor, it was little short of torture, but day by day he gritted his teeth and endured it. The boys' day began at dawn when they rose, went to Mass, and then broke fast with meat, bread, and ale. Studies came next, some Latin and French, a little law, mathematics, music, and penmanship. At 9:30 there was a second breakfast. Then the boys went to the tilt yard where they practiced jousting, using long wooden lances, running at each other first on foot, then on horseback. At noon they struggled out of their armor to prepare for dinner in the great hall. As pages they had to wait on the lords, carrying ewers and trenchers, and cups of wine held above their heads so as to not breathe upon it. In the afternoon there was hunting, hawking, riding over the moors for stag or wild boar. Supper came at 4 or 5, then a couple hours of singing and dancing, after which Richard, for one, tumbled into bed exhausted. The Earl of Warwick himself was almost never there. He was away with Edward IV, trying to subdue the still rebellious lords of Lancaster, who were unwilling to accept their defeat and were determined to bring back the old King Henry VI. Queen Marguerite, also determined to see her husband back upon his throne, had left King Henry waiting in Scotland and sailed for France to get help for him from his cousin Louis XI. During her absence, Henry foolishly crossed the border into England, was captured by men of York and taken prisoner to the Tower of London, so he was safely out of the way. The possibility that Queen Marguerite might get help from the King of France looked like serious trouble, both to the Earl of Warwick and Edward IV. But they disagreed on what to do about it. Edward favored making an alliance with Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Warwick, who was confident that he alone knew how to run the country and manage the king, proposed outsmarting that vile creature, Queen Marguerite, by going to France himself and making an alliance with Louis XI. This he did, and as he hoped, the King of France proved agreeable to his proposition, provided that England, in return, saw fit to help him against the Duke of Burgundy. To seal the bargain, they agreed that a young relative of Louis XI should marry Edward IV. The Earl was elated with his success and rushed back to London to make his report to the king and the council. There he was met with a shocking surprise. The king was already married. Now it all came out. On May 1st, 1464, in a hunting lodge, Edward IV had secretly married Dame Elizabeth Woodville. Dazzled by her beauty and charm, he had married a widow 5 years older than he, who already had 2 sons and a swarm of poor relatives trailing after her. Warwick was horrified. He stormed off in such a furious mixture of rage, disgust, and humiliation as to turn a white rose red and a good friend into a traitor. King Edward IV, growing yearly more good-natured and easy-going, with much loving and good living, was not overly disturbed by Warwick's fury, but he wanted to avoid an open break with his stormy cousin, so he let him go back to France to see what Louis would be willing to do even without the marriage. Edward, meanwhile, quite able to think for himself, had been in correspondence with Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. Warwick's ship had barely sailed for France when a ship from the Netherlands sailed into the Thames, bringing a half-brother of Charles the Bold to take part in a tournament. His opponent, equally skilled in the art of jousting, was Lord Rivers, a brother of the Queen, one of those numerous Woodville relations. It was a gala affair, with people streaming out from London to the grandstands, bright with flying flags and banners. The king appeared, clothed in purple, accompanied by chancellors, knights, esquires, and his youngest Knight of the Garter, his brother Richard, who was then 15. At the sound of trumpets, the 2 experts in the deadly art rode onto the field and contended violently until, as the chronicler reported, it became so perilous that the king in a high voice cried, "Woe!" and brought it to an end. The tournament, thus concluded, was not an end in itself. It was the celebration of a far more important event, the betrothal of the king's sister, the lovely Margaret of York, to Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, was a widower who had no interest whatsoever in taking another wife. All he cared about were war, conquest, and power. He sent his mother and his daughter Mary, a young girl of 11, to meet his bride when she arrived. Both found the new duchess young, exquisite, and completely charming. Even the surly Charles was taken with her in spite of himself, and to everyone's amazement the young bride seemed to find a way to temper the Duke's harsh nature as no one else had been able to do. The Duchess Margaret made a place for herself at once in the court of Burgundy, and captured the heart of her little stepdaughter Mary, who was herself engaged to be married. Her father, possessed with the ambition to be a king instead of just a duke, had approached the German Emperor Frederick III, who could bestow that title, and had arranged that his Mary should later marry the Emperor's 11-year-old son Maximilian, the Archduke of Austria. One person who was most happy over the treaty which brought Margaret of York to the court of Burgundy was William Caxton, an English merchant living in Bruges, who was to become known as England's first printer. Shortly after the Wars of the Roses began, William Caxton had been sent as an ambassador to the Netherlands to look after the interest of the many English wool merchants living there, and to straighten out their difficulties with the Flemish weavers, who bought great quantities of wool from England for their famous tapestries. This new treaty, sealed by the Duke's marriage, had settled so many of William Caxton's former worries that it had left him, he was pleased to say, with no great charge of occupation. Now he could browse to his heart's content in the Duke's library, poring over the gorgeously illuminated manuscripts and books. One day he came upon a popular French romance set in ancient Troy. To eschew sloth and idleness, as he put it, William Caxton began translating it from French to English. Copying it by hand he found so tedious and so hard on his eyes that he gave it up for a time, until the Duchess Margaret urged him to finish it for her. By that time he had learned of the German way of reproducing books by machine, and had heard that a printer who had learned the trade in Mainz had set up a shop in the city of Cologne. Soon Caxton went off to learn the new art. 3 years later he returned to Bruges and set up a press of his own. With the help of a famous scribe, Collard Mansion, he designed and cut the first English type, a very black letter known as Old English. The first English book ever printed was Caxton's own translation of the story of Troy, which he had copied for the Duchess. He sent a copy to Edward IV's Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, which contained an engraving showing him, William Caxton, presenting 2 volumes to his young patron, the Duchess Margaret. Margaret had been in Bruges less than 2 years when 2 refugees came from England in a fishing boat, her 2 brothers, Edward and Richard. Edward had lost his throne. Betrayed on all sides, he had fled for safety to his sister and his ally, the Duke of Burgundy. The Earl of Warwick, their cousin, had turned traitor. It was hard to believe, but Warwick, who had crowned Edward IV King of England, had gone over to Lancaster and acted as kingmaker again, this time for his former enemy Henry VI. This strange alliance was the clever work of Louis XI, King of France, who was no happier than Warwick was over the marriage between England and Burgundy. Queen Marguerite was still there at the French court when Warwick arrived, utterly furious with Edward. It was plain to Louis what might well be achieved with just a bit of flattery. Addressing the Earl as Prince, he gradually led Warwick to join hands with the lady whom he considered his most vilest enemy, Queen Marguerite, who had been previously charmed by Louis into embracing the hated Earl. So the former enemies had combined forces and arranged for the marriage of their children, Anne, Warwick's sad-eyed little daughter, and the royal prince. Warwick then had returned to England, and at the head of a Lancastrian army had taken Edward completely by surprise. The captain of the royal guard had also betrayed the king. His brother George had been bought off by Warwick. The troops had deserted. Edward had had to leap from his bed into the cold, foggy dawn and literally run for the shore. Closely followed by Richard, he had stumbled onto a small fishing boat and escaped. So there he was, at the court of Burgundy, Edward, 9 years King of England, now deposed. But he would be there only until he could assemble forces enough to fight his way back. It was then the fall of 1470. Meanwhile, in England, King Henry VI was again on the throne, and Warwick had become what he always aspired to be, the actual ruler of England. He was in his glory. Ah, the poor gentle Henry! For 5 years he had enjoyed peace and quiet in the Tower of London, able to read and pray undisturbed. Now he'd been dragged back again onto his throne, into the midst of wrangling and confusion, where he complained, "They do so interrupt me at night and day, I can hardly snatch a moment to be refreshed by my holy readings." Henry Tudor of Wales was a boy of 13 in that fall of 1470, when, to the great joy of the House of Lancaster, meek, good Henry VI was restored to his throne by the Earl of Warwick. It was a great day for the tall, blond English lad when he set out with his uncle Jasper Tudor on a journey to London to pay a visit to the king. It was the proudest day in the life of his determined little mother, Lady Margaret, who had come from Pembroke Castle to the harbor of Tenby to see them off. Only 14 years old when Henry was born, she was still so young and so small that she looked like a little girl as she stood smiling and waving to her son and brother-in-law as they sailed away. Henry was her only child. His father, Edmund Tudor, had died 2 months before Henry was born. From the moment Margaret saw her son, he had become the center of her life, her joy, the apple of her eye. Henry knew how glad she must be that he was now on his way to meet the king, the head of the House of Lancaster to which she belonged. As long as Henry could remember, his lady mother had been telling him with pride that way back she had the same royal ancestor as the king. Henry's father did not. The Tudors, she said, did not belong to the English royal family at all, even though his father and Uncle Jasper were half-brothers of the king. That, she explained, was because they had the same mother. After King Henry's father died, his mother, the young queen, had secretly married Owen Tudor of Wales, which had caused a scandal because Owen Tudor was not even a nobleman. Later, Henry VI had kindly ennobled his 2 half-brothers, making Edmund the Earl of Richmond and Jasper the Earl of Pembroke. Henry had been born in Pembroke Castle, and he and his mother had lived there in the care of his uncle Jasper until the House of Lancaster lost the throne to the House of York, and Edward IV had become king. That was 1461, and then, for Henry Tudor, who was only 4, the whole world had been turned topsy-turvy. Pembroke Castle had been captured, and his uncle Jasper had fled the country, and Henry himself had been hurried from one castle to another in Wales, until all the castles of Lancaster had been captured except Harlech, the strongest of all. And then, when Henry was 9, that castle fell. The new Duke and Duchess who came to live there took kindly care of Henry, but he knew he was actually their prisoner. But now he was free again. Now it was 1470. Those horrible years were over. The sun shone on the red rose again. The tables had been turned. The Earl of Warwick had changed sides. His daughter Anne had married the Crown Prince. King Henry, after 5 years as a prisoner in the Tower of London, was once more seated on his throne. Uncle Jasper had come home from France, and he, Henry Tudor, was on his way to visit the king. There are many conflicting stories as to where the 2 Henrys met. and what the gentle, weary King Henry VI said to the strong, good-looking boy of 13, who, with the help of his determined little mother, was to become Henry VII. As the young Tudor was then so far removed from any claim to the throne, it is most unlikely that the king mentioned his ever wearing the crown. It is agreed, however, that Henry VI was impressed by what he called the boy's wit and attractiveness. Only 6 months later, in March 1471, the tables had turned again. Henry VI had lost his throne, and the House of Lancaster was once more replaced by the House of York. Edward IV and his brother Richard, after 6 months in Burgundy, had returned with an army to attack the traitor, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick had been killed in battle. Henry VI's son, the prince, had also died in the battle. King Henry VI had been taken to the Tower and murdered. Queen Marguerite had fled back to France. Jasper Tudor hurried back to Wales. The only soul left now in the Lancaster family who had any claim whatsoever to the throne was Henry Tudor. Though the claim was slight, Lady Margaret felt it was no longer safe for her son to remain in Wales. She insisted that his Uncle Jasper take Henry overseas and find a refuge for him with Louis XI in France. Once more, the tiny figure of Lady Margaret was to be seen standing on the pier at Denby, waving farewell to her son, her heart filled with anxiety until she should hear that he was safely across the Channel. Weeks later, she heard that the winds had blown the ship off course, and Henry had landed not in France, but in Brittany. There for 13 years Henry Tudor was to be kept under strict guard by the Duke of Brittany, who was well paid for doing so by Edward IV.